You write that Zionism actually buttresses anti-Semitism. Explain that idea.
I mean, buttresses, or there's a complicated relationship between Zionism and anti-Semitism. And Herzl knew that and basically said in a diary entry that the anti-Semites can be some of our best advocates, because in a way, what Herzl was saying to the anti-Semites is, I have a solution to the Jews. I'll just take them out of Europe and we'll put them in, a nation state somewhere far away in the Middle East. And for a lot of European anti-Semites, that was a perfectly fine solution, especially given colonialism. So whether, one of the big questions that is asked these days is Israel a settler colonial project or colonial project? I mean, that's something that can be debated, but it really can't be debated that Zionism benefited from colonialism. And the idea that we can establish a Jewish nation state of Europe, mostly European Jews, although Jews from the Arab lands certainly came at the establishment of the state, in part of the world that was being colonized by Europe, in a certain sense, made perfect sense. So, in a way, Zionism was able to be as successful as it was for a number of reasons. First of all, it focused on the land of Israel, which spoke to the kind of historical and theological aspirations of Jews. And second of all, Europe began to crumble, and it became necessary, almost like an emergency situation. But there were problems that were inherent in Zionism from the beginning that I think we're still living with and we're seeing the fruits of today.
You talk about Zionism as essentially one of the core manifestations of the ideology is that it posits that Israel or the Jewish state makes you safe. You'll never be safe in the diaspora. And you break down anti-Semitism into three parts. I can't remember whether you get that from Hannah Arendt or whether that's your own formulation. But explain and the levels of danger from anti-Semitism is really determined by those three different forms or expressions of anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I borrow it from Arendt, but Arendt uses it in her essay, Reflections on Little Rock, really about racism, that there are three forms of racism, what she calls the kind of the individual, the social, and the political. And in a sense, she makes the claim that, I don't want to get into the Little Rock article about racism, but what I'm saying is that there are various forms of anti-Semitism. There are people that don't like Jews for whatever reason, but their dislike of Jews really remains very much within their private sphere. She calls it private, social, and political. And then there's the social anti-Semitism, which extends out of the private sphere into the social sphere. For example, like, summer camps and country clubs and all of things like that. And then there's the political anti-Semitism that actually becomes part of the political culture. And for Arendt, on the racism question, it's only when racism becomes political that it becomes really dangerous. And I was trying to, bring that to the question of anti-Semitism to show that, in fact, the difference between European anti-Semitism, certainly before the war, and anti-Semitism that exists in the United States today is that in the United States, anti-Semitism rarely really reaches the level of the political. It stays much more in the individual and the social sphere, which is not saying that's not a problem, but it doesn't necessarily curtail the ability for Jews to live as Jews in the United States, which is why I say in the book that I don't feel like Jews in America are oppressed.
Arendt also, when she writes about anti-Semitism, talks about the difference between vice and crime. And she actually writes in Origins of Totalitarianism that Marcel Proust perhaps explicated the nature of anti-Semitism better than anyone else in France at the turn of the century. And it was this notion, of course, Jews are, before the Dreyfus affair, are invited into the salon as kind of exotic figures, Swann being an example. After Dreyfus, this is the Alfred Dreyfus, the officer who was falsely accused of, he's Jewish, of selling secrets to the Germans. You see Jews shunned, but she says that for a crime can be expiated. You can serve time, you can be punished. Whereas when you're infected with the vice of of quote unquote Jewishness or whatever racism, that can never be washed away, that it's always there. Can you talk a little bit about that idea of anti-Semitism?
Yeah, I mean, in a certain way, she's getting that a little bit, perhaps, from Max Nordau, who calls anti-Semitism a disease, right? And it's the same basic idea. I mean, she uses this category of what she calls eternal anti-Semitism, which she uses critically because she really doesn't feel like anti-Semitism could be understood if it's understood as some kind of an eternal hatred. Although a lot of scholars of anti-Semitism make that argument. I think that what I tried to do in that chapter on anti-Semitism is really playing off Arendt's article, the long article, unfinished article that she wrote on anti-Semitism, and also the part of her totalitarianism on the origins of totalitarianism and anti-Semitism, is that we have to understand it within a particular historical context, and we can't just call everything the same thing. We can't just use this umbrella term to define how Jews were thought about in Christian Europe, how Jews are thought about in Muslim lands, how Jews are thought about in America, how Jews are thought about by Palestinians in Israel. Like, if you're just going to use that term anti-Semitism as a catch-all for hatred of the Jew, or Judenhass, as it was called in Germany, she feels like we're not really understanding the phenomena. We're just, in a certain sense, weaponizing it.